Final Cut Pro has a powerful manual color correction tool that you can use for a wide variety of color correction or enhancement effects. Traditionally, color correction can be applied to the image as a whole, often called primary color correction. With primary color correction, you adjust the overall exposure, saturation, or tint of the image. You can also target specific areas in the frame for enhancement or correction. For example, you might want to emphasize or mute the color of a car, or perhaps an article of clothing. This is often called secondary color correction. Because adjusting the image as a whole is where you often will start, we'll look at primary color correction first. Press Home to move the playhead to the drills clip. Then move your playhead over the clip and zoom in. From the Enhancements menu, choose Show Color Board or press Command 6. The color board is Final Cut Pro's new interface for correcting and enhancing your video images. The three primary controls for doing so are found at the top of the interface. You can adjust the color, saturation, and exposure of your video or still images. Often the best place to start when enhancing or correcting your video is exposure. This control allows you to darken or lighten parts of the image to improve the overall contrast. Contrast can best be defined as the ratio between the darkest pixel and the lightest pixel. Improving the contrast will give your images more punch by increasing the tonal range. The slider on the far left is a global control, which is to say that the entire range of pixels from light to dark are affected at once. Using the three separate sliders on the gray board will allow you to adjust the brightness values in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. For example, drag on the control for shadows and watch the image in the viewer. Notice that only pixels in the darker regions, i.e. the shadows, are affected by this control. Likewise, dragging on either the midtones or highlights control will affect the brightness in those areas. Having three separate controls will allow you to adjust one tonal range of the image while keeping the other tonal ranges isolated. While you could make these adjustments using the viewer alone, it's often helpful to see the image represented objectively using video scopes. From the Window menu, choose Show Video Scopes or press Command 7. The first scope that appears is called the histogram, and it shows you the relative distribution of your light and dark pixels. As you can see from the blue spike, the majority of the brightness is around 80%. The blue spike tells you that of all the colors in the image, blue is the most dominant. From the Settings pop-up, choose Waveform. The Waveform monitor is the primary scope for viewing the contrast in your image. The line at the bottom is 0%, and in the digital world, 0 is pure black. At the top of the Waveform monitor is a line reading 100. This is the upper limit of where your white levels can be and still be safe for broadcast. If you right-click on the scopes, you can bring up a menu of options for displaying the waveform. Choosing RGB overlay, for example, will allow you to see a composite of all three primary colors, red, green, and blue. Traditional scopes use a green display because in the video world, green represents the luminance channel. Pick whichever view you want. As you can see in the scope, these lines called traces are not touching the zero line, which means we need to darken the shadows a bit. Using the Shadows control, drag downward until the trace lines are touching the zero line. This should be around -3%. Let's stretch the contrast by dragging upward on the Highlights control while watching the waveform. When the value reads 12%, release your mouse. If your work is intended for broadcast, it's important to keep your highlights below 100 on the waveform monitor. Unlike legacy versions of Final Cut Pro, there is no Show Excess Luma command. There is, however, a broadcast safe effect you can apply to your clips. Just click the Effects button and type out Broadcast Safe in the search field. The effect can then be added to any clip by selecting the clip and double-clicking on the Broadcast Safe thumbnail. Once you're satisfied with the contrast, you can move to the next button, Saturation. Like the exposure control, you have a global slider for affecting the overall image saturation. Drag the slider all the way to the bottom and you'll remove all the color. Drag all the way to the top and the colors become cartoonishly vibrant. Often what's required is just a little saturation boost in either the shadows or highlights. For example, the sky is a bit dull and washed out. Drag the highlight slider upward until the value is roughly 50%. Doing this will bring back some of the blue in the sky. Now drag the shadow slider downward until the value is roughly -50, to remove any excessive blue that might be affecting the shadows. Once you've tweaked the exposure and saturation to your liking, you can make changes to the overall color balance of your image. The color board, as it's called, is a radical departure from the familiar color wheels found in most color finishing applications, and it may take some getting used to. The gray control on the far left is a global color balance control. In other words, this control affects the color balance in all three tonal ranges: shadows, midtones, and highlights. The control itself is sitting on a white horizontal line separating the color board into positive and negative color regions. For example, this global control is currently sitting over the green color field. By dragging downward with the control, in the negative direction, you'll be removing the green from the image. Removing green results in more red being introduced into the image. Dragging above the neutral line into the positive color field will add more green into the image. If you wanted to add more blue into the image, drag the global control to the right until it's over the blue color field, then drag upward. Dragging below the white line, of course, removes blue and adds the opposite color, which is yellow. By the way, the negative colors are not arbitrary. Yellow is the opposite of blue on the color wheel. You can see this on the tiny color wheel icon. I guess Apple couldn't completely abandon the notion of color wheels. But I digress. Unfortunately, there's no button to reset these individual controls, which is very odd. Press undo a few times to reset the global color tint control. If you click on the other three buttons, you'll quickly discover that you can affect the color cast in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. For example, let's say I wanted to add some more red into the midtones to counteract all the blue in the image. The midtones is also where flesh tones live, so this is the control you'll most often use to make the faces of your human subjects more natural. Drag the midtone control to the right until it's over the red color field. Now use your up arrow and tap 3 times to increase the red by 3%. You can also use your down arrow to move the control in a negative direction. If you want to save your correction adjustments as a preset, click the gear icon to bring up a menu of color presets. Choose Save Preset, then give your preset a name. Skim to the next clip and select it. From the same gear menu, choose the preset you just saved. To return to the inspector, click the left-facing arrow in the upper right of the color board pane. To see a before and after of your corrections, click the blue light to toggle the correction on and off. To continue making adjustments and return to the color board, click the rainbow arrow. You can also reset the correction by clicking the reset hook. Unfortunately, clicking this button resets all the controls: exposure, saturation, and color.